A presentation of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service National Conservation Training Center, providing leadership in learning to conserve fish, wildlife, and natural resources.
Hi, I'm Mark Madison, the historian at the National Conservation Training Center, and I'd like to welcome you to another in our series of talks with distinguished scientists, writers, historians, and others who are all involved in conservation. We call this series Conservationists in Action. Today we're very fortunate to have with us an expert in sea otters, Greg Sanders, who worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service for 18 years, is that correct?
That's right.
And currently is the biologist for the Minerals Management Service, is joining us today to talk about sea otter conservation. He's actually in town as part of a DOI retreat on ocean, so we're very fortuitous to have you out here. And I should just mention, as historian, I first met Greg when he very generously helped us obtain some sea otter artifacts for our archives out here. So thanks for that, and thanks for being with us this afternoon.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Mark. I really appreciate being out here. It's always a pleasure to be at the National Conservation Training Center. And as Mark said, I'm here actually to attend a Department of Interior-wide ocean conference where we're trying to bring all the bureaus together to talk about our mutual interest in the ocean. You might wonder why somebody from Minerals Management Service is here to talk about conservation of wildlife in particular. When I started at Minerals Management Service about 2 years ago, I learned that in that organization, our organization, we actually think of conservation as being conservation of oil and gas. But there's more to Minerals Management Service than just oil and gas. We're also looking into alternative energy, and we have a very active biological group, and I'm a marine mammal, seabird, and sea turtle biologist for the Pacific region. So today I want to talk about sea otters, something that I have spent quite a lot of time with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. As Mark mentioned, I was with the Fish and Wildlife Service for more than 18 years, and most of that time working on sea otter issues in California. Before that, I worked with the National Park Service, specifically Channel Islands National Park, as a seasonal interpretive ranger. Got my start in federal service, and I'm just very happy to be here today. Before I start the presentation, as far as a PowerPoint that I have, I also want to mention that there are a lot of other agencies that have been involved with this, and I'll note and highlight USGS because most of the sea otter research is now being done under the U.S. Geological Survey in conjunction with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and MMS has provided funding, and it's all a big group effort. So with that, I think I'll start my presentation. I've entitled it Southern Sea Otter Recovery, Fragile Balance. And I'll add one more thing, that I'm going to focus on a project called the Southern Sea Otter Translocation Program. Most of you are professional conservation folks, and I think this particular issue with the Translocation Program will be a case study for the turn of the century, 21st century that is, that people will be looking at for a long time to come, both in its strengths and its weaknesses. So with that, let's start my slideshow. We have some sea otters here up in Monterey Bay, and I'm calling this the fragile balance because we're looking at recovery of sea otters in conjunction with other human activities, which we're all faced with in our different wildlife management needs. But first, a little bit of background on sea otters, since some of you don't know about them too much, other than they're cute and cuddly. We have historically sea otters range throughout the entire North Pacific. This dark green area represents their historic distribution as of the late 1700s. In the 1700s, they were discovered by Europeans, specifically Russian explorers up in the North Pacific. And it was just a short time after these abundant fur-bearing mammals were discovered that there was a massive hunt. And there's a number of accounts that describe the hunt. It's quite dramatic. It really brought people together from all over the world, literally, to hunt in the North Pacific. Most people think of the gold rush in California as being bringing a lot of people to the west coast of what's now the United States. And that's true. However, what was bringing people to the North Pacific at that time was fur. And sea otter has the densest fur in the world, extremely valuable. We had the Russian explorers, we had the Russian hunters, and then we had English, French, and later American. And they were trading with China at that time with the pelts through the Hawaiian trade routes. So it's quite an interesting history, which I've spent a lot of time looking at. It's really fascinating. So by the time we got to the end of the 19th century, we have very few sea otters left. And these arrows on this map represent where some remnant colonies of sea otters remained as of about 1911, when international fur treaties were signed. Since this time, we've had abundant recovery of sea otters along what's now the Alaska coast and parts of Russia. But there's one arrow there off the middle of the west coast, and I'm sorry I can't point to it at this point, but it's right there in the middle, right in California, where there was a colony of perhaps as few as 50 sea otters left. In fact, they were thought to be extinct, but rediscovered in the 1930s. So how many sea otters are in California? Well, we expect that there was historically about 1,600 sea otters along the California coast. Today, based on the latest survey in 2007, it's about 2,800 animals, so significantly less than the historic abundance. If we take a look at a graph, and this will be, I think, the only graph I have in here of any complexity, so I apologize for that. But if you just look at the general trends, you can see that the numbers have been increasing since 1984 at the beginning of this map down up to about present time. Unfortunately, they haven't been growing at a rate very fast, however, and that's the focus of recovery efforts today, which I'll get to at the end of the presentation on what's going on right now. Sea otters are now ranging from about Half Moon Bay, and if you look at the very top, I see it's a little small there, but San Francisco is the very top, San Francisco Bay, and then past the islands there, you'll see Los Angeles at towards the bottom of the map there. And the purple is the current range of the southern sea otter in California. Now, southern sea otters were listed in 1977. And since that time, there was a recovery plan developed in 1982. And at that time, the primary recovery activity identified was translocating sea otters, moving sea otters from one area of the coast to areas of their historic habitat and establishing them there. And there was reason to believe that this would be a good strategy. In the late 1960s, early 1970s, there were large groups of animals moved from Alaska to areas along Oregon, Washington, what's now Canada, and also in British Columbia, Canada, as well as Southeast Alaska. Now, some of you, I'll put a little question out there, and I'm used to working with the audience and I could ask questions, but in this particular case, you might want to think, what was happening in the Aleutian Islands in Alaska in the late 1960s that would cause people to want to move otters from that area? Well, the largest below-ground nuclear tests were done on Amchitka Island at that time, and as part of the mitigation for that effort, sea otters were moved to these other areas. And those translocations were successful in many of the areas. We have about 2,000 otters in British Columbia today. We have about 500 to 800 otters in the Washington state today. The Oregon population didn't take hold. We have otters in Southeast Alaska where they otherwise wouldn't have. And these were all the result of translocations of otters from Amchitka Island. So in 1982, the recovery team for the southern sea otters thought that this would be a good chance to use the same technique to recover sea otters. Now, we ran into a problem with differences between the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act in establishment of experimental populations. And the Fish and Wildlife Service went all the way to Congress to seek specific approval for this translocation program. To my knowledge, this is the only program of its type that was literally authorized by an act of Congress and signed by the President of the United States, then President Reagan. And when it got to this point, essentially Congress said, the Fish and Wildlife Service, you can translocate sea otters. But if you do, you also have to do some efforts to mitigate the effects those sea otters may have on other resources, and they were specifically thinking about fishing resources. So what that resulted in, why was that? In the absence of sea otters, remember sea otters were pretty much extirpated from all of the Pacific coast about 150 years ago. And their primary prey items include many invertebrate species. This is sea urchins on the left and abalone on the right. And those species have in turn become important resources for people. At the top there's a vessel which is a commercial sea urchin vessel. And up till recently, sea urchins were California's #1 fishery, both in pounds landed as well as value, mostly as an export fishery to Japan. There's a diver there, a friend of mine, with some lobsters. And we've come to get used to the fact there's all these large invertebrates in large numbers there. So large that it's become mythical proportions. In Pismo Beach, this clam is the size of a house, which of course it doesn't get that big, but people have gone to Pismo Beach for years to do the Pismo clams. But as sea otters have come into areas and they reoccupy areas, they do have a significant effect on these resources. They are a keystone predator. They control invertebrate populations. And so for those species that people use, there's a conflict. And Congress sought to seek a balance between sea otter recovery and the needs of people. So we'll go on the next slide. And the Fish and Wildlife Service developed a translocation plan in 1987. Now I talked about this conflict, and the way it was resolved was the establishment of what was called a sea otter management zone. And in the case, after doing an environmental impact study, the Fish and Wildlife Service decided that San Nicolas Island, which is there in the pointed to as the translocation zone, San Nicolas Island would be the best place to translocate otters. First of all, it was certainly in historic habitat. There were good records, hunting records, that there were a lot of animals there. It looked like good habitat from a biologist perspective. There's lots of abundant invertebrates there. And then we surrounded that in consultation with the Department of Fish and Game in California, who wanted to control otters. And a management zone was established from Point Conception, which is the very end of that purple line there, down to the Mexican border. Note that it includes all of the offshore islands except for San Nicolas Island, which is translocation. 5 of those islands are within Channel Islands National Park. So essentially we're saying we're not going to allow otters back into historic habitat in the national park either. So that was the deal that was struck. So how did it work out? Well, from 1987 through 1990, the Fish and Wildlife Service took out 140 sea otters. We captured them off the coast of Central California and took them out to San Nicolas Island. Now, I'll have you watch the screen because my little otters here do have a tendency to wander about. In fact, after otters were taken to San Nicolas Island, most of them simply swam away from the island. We had a few that died at the island. A few, meaning we had a minimum of 3 that we know died as a direct result of the translocation. But otherwise, about half the animals that we took out there and that we know what happened to them swam away from the island and either to the central coast, some of them very close to where they were originally captured, and some into this designated management zone. Now, eventually those we went and captured, or the animals left the management zone. Some of those animals we think got into Mexico based on some records recently. I told you 1987 to 1990 was when we took the 140 out there. By 1993, there were 13 animals left at San Nicolas Island. Not quite what we had in mind. How about the management zone? This was an integral component of the program. We set out posters, a Sea Otter hotline poster here, essentially wanted posters for sea otters. And they were to call our office and we'd go out and capture them. The top right picture there is a picture of one of the rebreather divers. A rebreather is a type of dive equipment that doesn't produce bubbles. And what we essentially do is sneak up from underneath unsuspecting resting otters in a kelp bed. In the background you can see the trap we use. It looks kind of like a basketball hoop. And we just push that up from underneath them and pull a drawstring to close it and capture them, and then we can transfer them to net bags alongside of the boat. Now, catching sea otters is easier said than done, and I have a short video clip that I just want to introduce that we'll play here, talking about how sea otters, how we catch sea otters. And I mentioned we use divers, and I'm one of the divers, and we go and we jump off the boat and we navigate underwater towards the resting otters and then push our trap up from underneath. And the best way to show this is to actually show the video. So let's go ahead and see if we can go ahead and prop the video and you'll see how we do it. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video clip. I put that together, obviously putting the theme of Mission Impossible on there because it does seem like an impossible mission. In fact, each time that I go out and I catch sea otters, I'm amazed that we can actually do it. It's quite challenging and quite rewarding, but it's also very difficult. You saw the size of that management zone, and if you've been to California, you can appreciate some of the distances. We're talking about many hundreds of square miles that we're trying to keep otter free by simply capturing them one at a time. And this has been a problem with the Translocation program and is a factor in how the program is being evaluated at this point. So I think I'll go back to the slides, and let's talk about where the otters went in the management zone and then what actually happened after that. I mentioned that otters left San Nicolas Island, and some of them ended up as far south as San Diego. I mentioned there were some in Mexico, but once they crossed the border, they were safe. We couldn't chase them into international waters, so what few animals went down there apparently lived out what lives they had out in the balmy seas off of Ensenada. So the rest, off San Miguel Island, which is the furthest to the west, or that big otter that's on there is where San Miguel Island is. We caught 14 sea otters out there, including some pups. And we removed those and moved them to the Central Coast. Now, not taking any more otters out to San Nicolas Island, of course, there wasn't a lot more to leave San Nicolas Island. But after we caught all these animals several years later in 1997, we started seeing large groups of otters represented by these black otters coming down from the north. This was a natural range expansion of the population. Not only a few otters, we had as many as 100 otters show up literally overnight in the management zone. And fishermen called to the Fish and Wildlife Service to remove those otters because by law we were required to move the otters. They are in the no otter zone, and even though they didn't originate from the translocated colony, they are still considered part of the experimental population by regulation. When we were actually capturing these animals, another problem arose. Just simply capturing them was hard enough, but also animals do move back, and we had 2 animals that swam all the way back, and actually this was the topic of a children's book called The Adventures of Foky the Sea Otter. And there's a map down there. We caught, Foky was released. He was actually happened to be a rehabilitated sea otter pup from the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and we took him to San Nicolas thinking that would be a great place for him to live. He didn't think so, and he swam away. I watched him swim away from the island the same day we released him, and he was thought dead. But 2.5 years later, we caught him at the small island of Anacapa Island, which is in Channel Islands National Park. We captured him, we moved him up north of Monterey to the Santa Cruz area north of Monterey, and he swam all the way back and ended up at Catalina Island, which is off of the Los Angeles area. And we caught him again. Now, one interesting thing about Foky, and the reason he got the name Foky, was that he was hanging around with harbor seals. And if those of you, any of you are marine biologists, harbor seals, the genus is Phoca, so he got the nickname Foky. He was not only hanging around with harbor seals, we believe he thinks he was a harbor seal. He was actually attempting to copulate with these harbor seals and hanging out with them. You got to think of this as a young male that grew up abandoned by his mother with no other friends or other otters to see, and that was the closest surrogate I guess he had. So he went ahead and he swam back to where his harbor seal buddies were. And we caught him again at Catalina Island, moved him again. He swam all the way back and ended up taking a tour of Catalina Island and then out to San Clemente Island, which is an island managed by the U.S. Navy. And then there was a sighting of an otter that matched its description in Los Coronados Islands off Mexico, and that's when we stopped chasing them. The point I'm trying to make is that otters, simply capturing and moving an otter and expecting them to stay where we put them is not realistic. And even though we might think, well, of course, at the time the program was developed, the assumption was that's exactly what would happen. Otters we translocated to San Nicolas would stay at San Nicolas Island. Otters that we took out of the management zone would not return to the management zone after they were taken out. And all those assumptions were flawed. I lied, there was one more graph in this, and this is a typical a curve looking at what population growth we expected to have in the population at San Nicolas. That's the gray area. As you can see, we thought there would be some population stabilization, then it would grow precipitously to some estimated carrying capacity of the environment. And the red line down there represents what actually happened. So we're a long way from what was expected for the program. In the meantime, we reconvened the Southern Sea Otter Recovery team, and they published the latest recovery plan in 2003. And at this point, the recovery team recommended against translocations as being the best way to accomplish the objectives of increasing range and numbers of sea otters. Certainly, there were animals at San Nicolas, and there continue to be animals at San Nicolas Island. We actually have about 30 animals. The population is growing out there. But the idea that this population could serve as a reservoir if there was a catastrophic event like an oil spill or disease wiped out the population is no longer valid. So we're looking at that not working out at all. So sea otters don't always do what we expect as the message. There was a video clip in here which I can't play, but you already seen the otter coming up and jumping on the camera. You never know what they're going to do. And I think a message that we need to take as managers or what we call ourselves managers of wildlife. I don't think we manage wildlife, we manage people's activities for the most part. But most of you have stories probably of how animals didn't do exactly what we wanted them to do, and this is a classic example of that. But it was all couched in the political realm that we're working in, and caused us a lot of problems as far as how we're going to deal with this legally into the future. As a result, we did a complete reevaluation of the translocation program, and it was done as a supplement, as an appendix to the Supplemental Environmental Impact Statement, which is actually went out in 2005. And since I left the Fish and Wildlife Service, it hasn't been finalized at this point. I'm hoping that the Fish and Wildlife Service will finalize it soon. But in that document, we suggest declaring the translocation program a failure. Now, there was a lot of people that were very resistant to declaring it a failure. We didn't really want to admit failure. But in this case, it just did not meet the objectives set out for the program. So now we're faced with trying to figure out what to do with the program. So it's been recommended that we declare it a failure. And it's been out for public review, and Fish and Wildlife Service, my replacement, is now challenged with doing that document. So that's the end of my story on the translocation program for right now, and I'm hoping there will be some questions on that because I know I went through it rather quickly. But I did want to not leave without looking at what the current recovery effort is for the southern sea otter. Right now, we have a large number of animals die each year. Well, so what? Animals die all the time. But this animal represents what we would consider a prime-aged animal. And what's unusual about the southern sea otter population, and I'll remind you of that graph I had in the beginning, it was growing but not very fast. Other populations of sea otters, like in Washington, have grown at a rate of about 17% a year, whereas in California it's 5 to 6% a year. What's the difference? Well, it appears that we're losing a lot of our prime-aged animals, or many prime-aged animals, before they've been able to reproduce and add to the population. So this animal has very nice teeth on it. Usually an older animal would have its teeth worn down. We would expect young animals to die in the population, old animals to die in the population, but not as many prime-aged animals as we appear to have based on stranding records in California. There are a lot of threats to sea otters right now. Oil spill has been listed traditionally as the primary threat. That includes shipping traffic and so on. The upper right-hand picture represents fishery mortality, and we had significant mortality in gillnet fisheries in California. And working together with the state of California, have established moratoriums on gillnet fishing, which have helped the sea otter population. So those two, oil spill is still always there. The fishing gear entanglement appears to be reduced. But what we're finding is very interesting disease issues, and this lower left-hand picture shows a drain. And we're seeing sea otters as a remarkable indicator of what's going on in the nearshore environment and how closely related that environment is to the terrestrial environment that we all use. Traditionally, terrestrial and marine environments are managed separately. But as sea otters, as we look at sea otters, we're seeing terrestrial diseases borne by waterborne bacterial infections and so on that are now the focus of what we're looking at for sea otters. Now, sea otters are cute and cuddly. I just gave you a little bit of the carousel of what's going on with sea otters. This is a picture from Disneyland. And in Southern California, where we hadn't had sea otters for 150 years, we're now questioning, whether we should have this management zone and whether sea otters should be allowed to expand into their historic habitat and not just be a place not be something you see at Disneyland. And I close with a picture of my daughter and wife at Disneyland and riding the wild sea otter ride that I've been riding for quite a while with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So that's all I had for the presentation, and so I'd like to open it up for any questions that are out there. I know I went quick. I think we got plenty of time for questions at this point, and maybe Mark has a few.
I'm sure I do, and I'd just like to remind folks, those of you tuning in, there's numerous ways to ask questions. We'll run a phone number up there in a minute and email. And those of you who have this device, the push-to-talk speakerphone, you can just push the button and talk, hence the name. And we'd welcome some questions on any aspect of sea otter conservation, which, excuse me, I'm sure Greg would be happy to answer. Early on in your discussion, you mentioned sea otters eat a lot of sea urchins and so on. What does a habitat look like that has a robust population of sea otters? What does that marine ecosystem look like?
Well, the marine ecosystem in Central Coast, where we have a lot of sea otters, has a lot fewer invertebrates. I showed you a picture of a sea urchin. And in Southern California, you'll find sea urchins out in the open all over the place. And you won't see that in the Central Coast. Abalone, they're not extinct in the Central Coast. They're actually fairly abundant in the Central Coast, but they're limited to cracks and crevices where they have refugia from sea otter predation. And there's certainly the suite of species evolved with sea otters, and so sometimes we have folks that are saying we're trading a whole bunch of species for just one. But that's certainly not the case. And we have a very diverse, and actually there's probably more diversity in a sea otter area than we see in some other areas which may be dominated by one invertebrate that's grazing, and specifically like sea urchins. There's areas called sea urchin barrens, which are barren of everything but sea urchins. Now, to say that, there's a dynamic which has been discussed. It's classic ecological literature. Jim Estes has worked on it up in Alaska, where you have the sea otters controlling invertebrates and then in turn having more kelp grow. And that's a fairly simplistic way of looking at it. What we're seeing is a lot of shades of gray now. If you look at Southern California, there are other predators that control some of these invertebrates. So even in the absence of sea otters, something's going on. And so when sea otters come back, it just shifts that balance so much more. We're really interested to see, in working with actually some of my counterparts in the National Park Service who are doing kelp forest monitoring at Channel Islands, if sea otters do re-enter those areas, we'll have a great baseline data to look at and see what changes actually happen with sea otters. And it's really pretty exciting.
Yeah, because the Estes study is often used as an analogy to the wolves helping the willows recover from so the elk don't browse them in Yellowstone and so on. I wondered if that's what we could expect to see if they.
We'll expect significant changes as a result of sea otters moving into historic habitat. There's no question in our mind. In fact, in our analyses and looking at the impacts of allowing the management zone to go away, we had to look at potential fishery impacts, and the assumption that was made that certain fisheries would not be in existence after otters became established, and those would be like sea urchins, lobsters, and crabs. Were three of the ones that we targeted. And so what would happen is that you would not see the large numbers. The size ranges of some of the species will likely change. Like abalone, you won't necessarily see as many large abalone, but abalone start breeding at around 1.5 to 2 inches long. So they're fecund at that time, and they're breeding, even though we've become accustomed to seeing large abalone, at least historically. Now, abalone are actually have been overfished in Southern California, so they're actually not being fished at this time, and that's directly related to human pressure.
Another marine mammal.
Another pseudo-marine mammal that we have. Yeah.
What was your background? How did you end up doing sea otter conservation?
Well, I went to school. Well, I even have to go back a little further. My mom sent me a picture one time. I became a dive instructor while I was in college, and I after college, not having much better to do, I went to work as a dive instructor. And my mom sent me a picture, and the one thing I wanted to do when I grew up in second grade was be a deep sea diver. So I always had an interest in doing diving and so on. And then I was very interested in aquatic biology. That's what I studied in school. I thought I was going to get into aquaculture, which is where I thought would be an interesting thing, but aquaculture still hasn't really quite taken off in the marine world. And I kind of fell into the sea otter business from when I was at Challenge National Park. I was working as an interpretive ranger there, and they were looking for someone that could be a biologist, a diver, and in addition accept law enforcement responsibilities, which I didn't even touch on. I did that for a while because we were concerned that people were going to go out and shoot our sea otters at San Nicolas Island. That combination ended up being relatively rare, so I was hired into Fish and Wildlife Service, and it went from there. So I came in on the ground level of the implementation of the Translocation program. I didn't have much to do with the actual planning stages, which I can now keep myself away from. And then I was there through the end of the wrap-up and the evaluation, and hopefully we'll be able to complete this evaluation, we meaning Department of Interior, Fish and Wildlife Service, and move on to some of the other important recovery needs. But it's been quite a challenge to unweave what was woven before, and I think that's a lesson to be learned. What looked good on paper didn't work out, and I think we could have predicted some of that. You know, we could have maybe put out more leaflets for the sea otters to read so they knew where the border was of the management zone. But, you know, when we work with wildlife, we get a lot of surprises. That's what makes it interesting, and certainly has made Sea Otter Recovery interesting. And as we look at this program up in Canada, as that population is expanding into fishery areas, their recovery plan, which I reviewed in Canada, was looking at the possibility of zonal management of sea otters, just as we did in California. And I urge them to tread lightly in that area, because no one's going to accept, at this point in time, lethal removal of the animals. So the idea that you can just capture them and move them is really quite simplistic. And it does look good when you're trying to make that compromise and hammer it out in an office someplace, or maybe on Capitol Hill. But we needed to take a good hard look at the facts, I think, when we go down that road. And
I just do want to remind folks, if you have a question for Greg, please call in. But I've still got a few more for you in the interim here. You mentioned an earlier translocation of sea otters that worked, right, from the Alaska area. What were some of the parameters that were different with the San Nicolas translocation?
That's a good question. I mentioned several translocations. There were translocations to Southeast Alaska, British Columbia, Vancouver Island specifically, Washington, and Oregon. And the Oregon animals all disappeared. We don't have any. We have some stray otters that we're seeing now, but they're not from a population in Oregon. And Washington was thought to have failed, actually. And it had a very similar pattern to what we're seeing at San Nicolas Island. So at San Nicolas Island, those otters could respond and grow. Now, I forgot to mention a key part of the San Nicolas program. When we originally set it up, we said if it were declared a failure, we would remove the animals from San Nicolas Island. So now we're in a situation where we're saying, well, we've got to remove these animals after taking all that work to get them established. But not only that, we had some animals that died shortly after release from the management zone, and these were animals that had not been tagged that were likely offspring of San Nicolas animals. Taking animals from a food-rich area where they grew up and putting them into a high-density food-poor area, high-density sea otter area and food-poor area has potential risks, which we may have a problem with in the future. So what we proposed is to leave the animals at San Nicolas Island, which requires change in regulations. But get back to the question of success. I think the key difference is the otters, when they were taken there, could go wherever they wanted. And they didn't, they were sufficiently removed from they weren't going to swim back to Aleutians, so they had to actually go someplace else. And where the otters were released in Washington State, for example, is not where they ended up. Now, if they had a similar program where there was no otter zone where they ended up, and you kept moving them back, then they probably, it's good likelihood that they would not have succeeded in that translocation. So that's one difference. There's other food-related differences and isolation, and there's a number of other things. But yeah, it got a lot of people scratching their heads. Seemed to work there. Why not here?
Well, that's the interesting part about science. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. What made San Nicolas appealing as an island to translocate them to? It looks like it's pretty far, actually, off the coast from the maps you showed us.
It's a very good point. Well, I mentioned earlier that it was a historic location for otters, and it was also a, we had subtitle surveys. We did baseline surveys. One of the things we were trying to do is to establish what was there before and after sea otters. We've had so few otters that we can't see much differences in the baseline surveys, even though they're continuing. But the other thing that was an important factor in that decision, and you mentioned how far it was offshore, was that there was a deep ocean channel between the mainland and the island, and it was thought that they wouldn't be able to traverse that channel. And so it would be easier to contain them there. Another myth busted, because they not only swam across, they swam across with gusto, and some of them swam across more than once. It's amazing what you can dry lab in thinking. Otters have a very high metabolism. They require a lot of food. The assumption was that they need to eat a lot, and they can't survive a voyage of that type. Several days without feeding, and they have to get to the bottom to feed. Obviously, that's not the case. They are swimming very fast, or they can fast for a certain amount of time and get across the channel. So we have firmly disproved that sea otters cannot cross deep ocean channels. Now, although I've been calling the translocation a failure, there's so many successful aspects of it. The idea that you can move otters out there, the idea that we did get a colony out there. If we had left the animals at San Miguel Island, we probably would have had a second colony there. So there would have indeed been a recovery action spreading otters into historic habitat. Plus all the things we learned. I mentioned about the deep ocean channels. And now what has been very important is that it's a very good comparative population for the mainland range. Now we have otters that are in a very food-rich area, and we're comparing their body type to the Central Coast animals and finding that indeed we think now that the Central Coast population is food limited. There was some debate over that. But otters at San Nicolas Island, those ones that stayed, are very robust animals. There are many, otters are generally between 40 and 60 pounds in adult range in the Central Coast. At San Nicolas Island, it's not unusual to have 50 to 80 pounds. And in Washington State, where we have this translocated population, we have the record-holding animal. A friend of mine, Brian Hatfield from USGS, has the record for capturing one in a Wilson trap, 110 pounds. These are large animals, and a lot of people don't realize that. They're kind of the size of a Labrador retriever if you cut off its legs.
Which we don't recommend.
No, we don't.
What about their behavior do you think is making them leave San Nicolas Island, or made them leave? I mean, it seems like there's lots of food. Sea otters had lived there in the past. Why would they take this arduous journey?
That's another good thing, and it's another thing that we learned. First of all, we think they have much more stronger homing behavior than we expected. They're very gregarious animals. They like to hang around with their own units. And these animals were basically captured, not necessarily at random. They were captured, how they could be captured in the Central Coast, and they were taken away from areas which they were familiar with, taken away from areas where there were other animals and presumably they would associate with. So that homing behavior is much stronger, and that's not unusual. Mm-hmm. In fact, I was interviewed for a paper once, and the reporter was asking me a lot of questions and so on, and I got caught up in, they were trying to find that sound bite, and I said it was kind of like Lassie going home, and that became Lassie syndrome for sea otters, which I have not let down since. But the other thing that's very interesting in comparing these populations is that the animals we took out to San Nicolas Island, there was a lot of effort. These were all tagged animals, and there's a lot of effort looking at what they were eating, and many of them brought their dietary preferences from home, presumably, to San Nicolas Island. There's a lot of variation in what sea otters eat, and so we had otters that were eating sand crabs when there were abundant lobsters and abalone and urchins around. And why were they doing that? And over the years, as we've had multiple generations at San Nicolas Island of sea otters now, all of the dietary niches converged on one, where they're feeding primarily on sea urchins and kelp crabs and such. And there's some very interesting work being done, again by U.S. Geological Survey in conjunction with the University of California, on looking at dietary preferences of individual animals, and it's been another success with looking at what's going on in this population and comparing it to San Nicolas. And it goes beyond that. There's other very good work that I haven't even touched on up in Alaska. Some work's been done in the past in Washington, and that work's expanding over into Russia now. Some of you may be aware that the southwestern population of otters in Alaska has declined precipitously and has since been listed as threatened. And now comparative work is being done on the Commander Islands in Russia. And I've just been invited by USGS to go out there this summer, and we're going to try and recapture some animals that were brought in. I've got some wildlife right here.
Wildlife in the studio here.
So, but anyway, it's really fabulous work. It's amazing. You can compare what's going on in Alaska and Russia to what's going on in California and Washington, and it's really telling us a lot about sea otters and the environment that they live in. I only barely touched on the water quality issues in California, and comparing California to areas like Washington and Alaska, where you have different freshwater influences. It's just, there's so much work to be done out there. I do, many of my MMS colleagues are ready to say, Greg, you gotta let sea otters go. But fortunately, it's being the marine mammal position, and sea otters are coming right into our areas where we work. I still get to keep my fingers involved with it.
And we appreciate you doing it out here. You mentioned water quality. Let's talk about that a little, because it reminds me of one of our condor researchers who told me in oral history, California is a hell of a place to try to recover a species because there's a huge human impact in the area. What is the water quality issue for sea otter?
Well, one of the more interesting issues that's gotten a lot of press in the last few years is a protozoal parasite called Toxoplasma. And Toxoplasma is a parasite that lodges in the brain of the non-hosts. And it's generally associated with cats. And so those of you that have had pregnant spouses and significant others know that one of the things they say is don't change the cat litter, because if you get exposed to Toxoplasma at a critical time in a pregnancy, it can cause problems with the pregnancy or stillbirths. So we're finding Toxoplasma in sea otters. And how do you get, the only way you can get Toxoplasma is you expose to cysts, which come out of the back end of a cat. So we don't have sea otters existing with cats. And so right now the presumption is that these cysts, which are shed by cats in the environment, are washed off in these flashy water events. You know, California, it doesn't rain there, it actually just pours. And when it pours, a lot of water goes off very quickly. So the water flushes these cysts into the seawater. Well, the ocean's a great diluter, so it should be just fine, right? How do you get contaminated if it's so diluted? But many of these cysts can survive in the marine environment, and we've now proven that they can be reconcentrated by filter feeding invertebrates, which are prey items for sea otters. And thus, there's a mechanism for sea otters to become infected by a terrestrial parasite. There's a similar parasite called Sarcocystis neurona, which is found only in possums, the opossum, which is not native to California. It was introduced about 80 years ago. That's also been found in sea otters. So we have some of those very interesting phenomena that some folks have done some really great work with the California Department of Fish and Game. Again, in conjunction, I can't overemphasize the collaborations that's gone on in the research between that, Monterey Bay Aquarium, and so on. So we have private, government, state, all working together on sea otter issues. It's an easy issue to work with because most people like to throw money at sea otters, and I know some of you are jealous out there because you might have a species that doesn't have as much of attention. In this case, of course, I'm a little biased. I think it's worthwhile because it's such an indicator of what's going on in the nearshore environment, not only for sea otters, but the invertebrate populations.
It seems to be a keystone species in some ways.
It definitely is.
For that environment. You mentioned briefly, we should follow up on that. What is the thinking behind the collapse of the southwestern Alaska sea otters?
There's been a number of hypotheses suggested. One of the more prominent is that there's been a shift in killer whale diet, where it wouldn't take more than a couple of killer whale pods to actually have a significant effect on the population in the Aleutian Islands. So that's been brought up, and the whole idea of cascading ecosystems where there's these shifts going on. And some people have suggested that it goes back to the great whaling period where great whales were taken out of the system and then other species became more numerous and it just cascaded down. So that's one suggestion. It's still unclear, and there's a recovery team that's being put together and they're trying to identify areas to look at, and where most of the current emphasis is again looking at comparative work in other areas, which require keep coming on the theme of cooperation. If you don't get some cooperation from the Russians, you're not going to get to the Commander Islands. And so there's been some excellent work done in getting those relationships developed. Because interestingly enough, in the Aleutian Islands, you have this very long chain, about 1,000 miles long, and otters have been declining across that chain. Well, at the very end of that, and just across a very narrow channel, are the Commander Islands off of Russia, and their populations are robust. So something the Russians are doing is better than we're doing. I don't know. We'll find out. Hopefully we'll find out more as we get the data.
Do they not have killer whales over there?
Well, you'd assume that killer whales could transverse the same area. But there's a lot of things, of course, we don't know, and that, again, makes it more interesting.
Something I've heard you speak very animatedly about, and we should address, because it just came up briefly in the video snippet. What is the technology and the process you actually use to capture and translocate these sea otters? Give us some more detail about that, because you were walking around the archive showing me equipment and so on, and it was really fascinating what you guys were using.
Well, I'm a diver, and I'm one of a handful of divers that have captured otters. There's probably about 8 of us at this point in time, and it's quite challenging, as I indicated, and hopefully you got a kind of feel for it from the film. There are other ways of catching otters. You can just go up and grab them with a net or put out a fishing net, like an entangling net. And I just saw in the archives, I saw Bob Sea Otter Jones' boat. He's one of the pioneers of otter work up in the Aleutians and a refuge manager up there. And so it was really impressive to see that. But what has happened as we tried you can capture otters that way. And in fact, some otters in Russia have been captured with nets recently. But to recapture the otters, you really have to target individual animals. And we've developed a technique, started out by our colleagues in the state of California. In fact, the trap is called a Wilson trap, named after the biologist in California that first developed it. And that was that basket-shaped device. And that's mounted on an underwater vehicle, which helps push the trap through the water and pulls the diver. And we've added onto that technology closed-circuit oxygen scuba, or it could be mixed gas oxygen. But for those of you that aren't divers, all that means is that the gas that you're breathing is recirculated, and it's scrubbed. The carbon dioxide that you exhale is scrubbed out, and then the gas is recirculated, which enables you to very efficiently use. You only need a very small bottle of oxygen, and also not produce any bubbles, because the bubbles otters can see. They can hear, they can smell them, especially if you had a garlic sandwich at lunch. So we want to decrease every opportunity to have those otters sense that we're there. And they are quite surprised. And I heard a remark earlier here in the studio. I said, well, they're probably not very happy about being caught. And that's true. They're little teddy bears of the sea, but once you catch them, they become little Tasmanian devils. And I got bit once separating mom and pup, but other than that, we can pretty much handle them. And it's quite interesting.
So when they're caught in the net, then how do they get out to the island after that point?
Well, when they were caught, some of the otters that were originally taken to the island weren't caught with the traps because they didn't have to be as specific. But originally for the translocation program, otters were captured on the Central Coast. They were put into a van and transported to the Monterey Bay Aquarium. Okay. And they were stabilized at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and then they were taken by plane to San Nicolas Island. San Nicolas Island is, I didn't mention, is managed by the U.S. Navy. They have a 10,000-foot runway on the island. Quite an interesting history of experimental work with weapon systems out there. It's closed to the public, but the Navy graciously offered their facilities, and we could not have done it without them. So I do think we need to acknowledge the Navy and their participation in this for sure. Again, collaboration, collaboration, collaboration.
Sure.
But they were flown out to the island, and then they were taken in kennels from the planes and released originally into holding pens. So we thought the idea would be to gather groups of otters, since they're social animals, and have them socialize with each other and then passively release them from these floating holding pens. What we found is they were extremely stressed in the holding pens, so much so that we had several animals die. And so they were then immediately released from shore from then on out in small groups instead of these large groups, because we had problems with how much time it was taking. Another part of the dry lab process, people thought, well, if we take them out in groups of 24, that'll be efficient, they'll be able to socialize with each other and so on. But once you caught the first few animals, it was harder to catch the next, so some animals were waiting in line at the aquarium for a long time before they could be taken out. And that put a fair amount of stress, because these animals, like many wild animals, are not accustomed to being in a closed environment, in a small tank. So the captive stress was fairly high. So a number of moves were done to reduce that captive stress and bring them out. So.
We're just about out of time, Greg. So one last question. Is there anything else that was interesting about their natural history that we should know about? Like you just told us they can have a temper. We didn't necessarily know that about them.
Oh, there's so many aspects about sea otters, and I would encourage anybody that's interested to do a little more research on your own. And if you're out in California, that's one of the best places to see otters. There's other places, of course, you can see them in Alaska readily, and so on and so forth. But take a look. There's a lot more to that species than most people think. I just don't have a specific one I could tell you.
You mentioned before, they're very popular and people want to spend money to recover them. Why are they so charismatic?
Well, look at them.
They have a mustache. And
yeah. I begin to look like the species I study. I think they are just very, I've been accused of using cute and cuddly tactics to get things through. But they're very charismatic, just like a bald eagle is, just like a condor is. Right. They are one of our suite of charismatic megafauna that have driven people to respond to have the Endangered Species Act, and so I think for the most part, I've found very few people that can't be endeared by a sea otter. There are a few that are out there that are direct competitors with sea otters, and they
yeah.
think they're sea weasels or sea rats, but other than that, it's hard to beat them as far as a symbol of the nearshore environment. They also stay close to shore, so they make it very convenient to see them. They're not like the great whales, which you have to look at video most of the time.
Right. Well, Greg, thank you. This was a fascinating afternoon.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed all the information you gave us, all the work you've done for Sea Otter Recovery and Translocation, so thank you very much.
I appreciate coming.
I'd like to thank those of you who took the time to tune in to watch this broadcast and let you know that our next broadcast will be in May, where we're going to look at restoring chestnut trees that are resistant to the chestnut blight. So please tune in May, and please go to the Distance Learning broadcast site for a schedule of all our upcoming broadcasts. Thank you.